can say this about season 4. It is going to be so worth the wait.
Nowhere, actually.
A wrecking machine. I'll take it.
I'm still figuring out my own style, Mark, actually.
It was great.
It took 2 minutes and I had to answer, yeah, go for it.
Are you sure you're not interested? I was like, don't ask me again. I can't refuse that twice.
In Holland, in one country.
Here is the YouTube.
She got me so deep and underwater and I drank it. That's not good.
You'll try chocolate from South Africa to Australia to England. It will taste so different.
So it's been really amazing that it's been with you after 10 long years.
The first title we were messing around with, we were going to call it Lockdown. Yeah. And then after a while, we actually kind of realised, God, this is dragging on a lot longer than what we thought it was going to be.
I didn't want to give people a reminder.
Our bass player has a band. We were like, let's go on the road, man. But and then it just came to a screeching halt.
We had to work on like how I was biting the carrot. Like I had to do it very purposefully, you know? You didn't want a weak bite, but you didn't want a bite that was too strong.
Someone jumps the stage and one of our techs just body slams him to the ground and you can see me kick him.
I guess I was too distracted. I was having too much fun. Never a bad thing.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Jonah. Hello. Hello, Mark.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'm Mark Sugiyama from Eclectic Arts based here in Seattle, Washington. Thank you so much for joining me on this Monday, April 19th, 2021. And I hope that you have having a good start to your week. And I'm really excited to be talking to my guests today, as well as some other guests that are coming up. So speaking of which, I do have more live streams this week on Wednesday at noon, and then Thursday at 9 a.m. and Friday at noon, again, Pacific Daylight Time here on the West Coast of the US. And if you follow me as Eclectic Arts Media, one word, on Instagram, that's where I post all the details first. And sometimes there's clips and behind the scenes things. And then I migrate things over to Facebook at times, but not all of the content from Instagram ever makes it over to Facebook. So if you want to know what's going on, you always want to check me out on Instagram there. And I do have things coming up next week as well. And then, we'll be into May, and we'll kind of see where things are at that point. But I'm always so grateful when I get a chance to talk to all of the wonderful guests that I have during this virtual interview live stream format that I have. And something that I haven't been pushing too hard, but if you are inclined and are in a position to do so, I always appreciate any kind of tips or donations, which come through here. And only if you're in a position to do so. Everything goes right back into what I do. The streaming service has actually been paid for in terms of breaking even by a generous donator, but a generous donation a couple of months ago. But in terms of backdrops, some of my technical gear, people know that I still use my phones for these interviews. So again, anything that gets donated goes right back into what I do. It's not something that I sit there and pocket and just, I have extra dollars to go grab a beer or something. That's not how I work. So just kind of know where your money's going. I try to always post about that also on my Instagram so people can kind of see where things are going. But that's only, again, if you're in a position to do so and you feel so inclined. So, and that link is always in the YouTube description of every video that I put on YouTube. It's also on the Twitch page if you're following me over there on Twitch. And I'll take that off for right now. So speaking of which, if you are watching this on YouTube and you're new to my channel, if you could do me a huge favor and subscribe. Hit the notification bell if you want to know when future live streams are coming up, or at least like the video. That always helps. And then if you're on the Twitch side of things, if you could follow me over there, that's always good as well. I'm Eclectic Arts on Twitch, and you'll see the same avatar across all of my social media. It's the same picture on everything, including my business email too. So you'll kind of know if you found the right one or not. Okay, so let's start off this week with this wonderful interview that I've been looking forward to for a while. My guest today is an award-winning photojournalist. She has also written, directed, and produced a fantastic documentary film called The Last Animals. Please welcome to the Eclectic Arts Virtual Studio, Kate Brooks.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm well. Holding up.
That's great. Yeah, I'm so glad that we're connecting and get a chance to talk about your work and your film. And I just finished the Seattle International Film Festival yesterday, so I'm in movie mode still. So this is awesome. So yeah, let's just kind of jump right into The Last Animals. What prompted you to start the idea for this documentary?
Well, I worked for a long time in conflict zones, particularly in Afghanistan. So, gosh, back in 2010, I had been on a military embed in Afghanistan, and I left that and went on a pre-planned vacation to Africa, and I was in Kenya. And I was spending a lot of time during that trip thinking about all the sort of human destruction I just witnessed, and then it was basically the sight of a herd of elephants in the wild. I found it to be this incredibly healing experience. The reminder that there's something bigger than and greater than the natural, there's still natural world than mankind. And so I knew at that point that I wanted to do work on wildlife, but I didn't really know in what capacity. And fast forward a few years, there was, a massive uptick in poaching. I did a fellowship at the University of Michigan. And during that fellowship, there was an incident in which approximately 80 elephants were gunned down on the border of Chad and I believe it was Cameroon in a single incident. And I just knew at that time that I needed to pick up my cameras and try to shed light on the issue.
Okay, so do you have a previous film background prior to this film?
I worked on one documentary before this. It was in Afghanistan. It was about the Afghan women's national boxing team. And with that, that just sort of happened. And by chance, the director and I met. He was looking for a female cinematographer. I had been sort of gravitating towards wanting to do cinematography. And due to gender dynamics and the subject matter, there were certain scenes that really a woman was needed to film. So they brought me on, and I kind of fell in love with the in-depth nature of filmmaking and the collaboration of teamwork. And when it came to deciding to try to do a documentary on The Last Animals, I had never directed a film before, but I had many years of doing photojournalism work and just decided to try.
Okay, well, that's been a common thread with a lot of the creatives that I've done interviews with, where they keep saying, like, when it's the question of what advice would you give someone new, it's like, just get out there and try it. Get out there and do it, and don't overthink it. And you're going to make mistakes, but as long as you make mistakes falling forward, that's okay, because it's too easy to talk yourself out of something. And it sounds like in your case, you're like, yeah, I'm really interested in this. I want to tell this story, so I'm just going to kind of get out there and do it.
Yeah.
Wow. So I'm curious, for people that haven't seen the film, what kind of situations did you put yourself in? Because this was not necessarily, I don't think, an easy film to actually film to get the footage, because you're talking about a really controversial subject.
I always joke. I tell people, please remind me when I'm ready to direct my next film to make sure that it's not spread out over 4 continents and 5 languages. It was really, really complicated because we filmed in multiple countries in Africa, a number of countries in Asia, regularly did filming in San Diego, Seattle, and in the Czech Republic. And then there were some additional trips beyond that. So it was very, very complex, managing all the storylines, working across multiple time zones frequently. At the time, I lived in Beirut, although I was never really home. And I had producers in Los Angeles, so it wasn't unusual to be having conference calls at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And it really, the whole project consumed me for a solid few years.
Okay, and so can you think of times, as you're just mentioning about different time zones, different countries, different cities, that some of the footage that ended up in the final edit of the film looks like things that were shot undercover? There are things where if you clearly had a camera visible, they would have wanted you out of there. Did things get tense in certain situations?
Some of the undercover filming, well, first of all, in a lot of the situations in which we filmed traders, it was done undercover. The traders are well aware of the fact that what they're doing is illegal or controversial. So generally speaking, they would not be cooperative with it. So we're doing secret filming in those situations. And there was one scenario in which I was with a rhino horn dealer, and that was particularly tense because we were inside a gated compound. And while I was sitting in the room, I noticed that they too had video cameras filming. They were involved in a variety of illegal activities. So that was quite stressful because in that situation, I think if we had been found to have had the hidden cameras that we did, it could have been quite dangerous. And then traveling around Africa, you're always, having to worry about malaria. I was regularly taking anti-malaria pills, small planes. And then some of the filming was done in a park in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's on the border of South Sudan, in which, poachers were frequently coming over from across the South Sudanese border. And there were still Lord's Resistance Army remnants in the park. And so sometimes people were being kidnapped. Rangers were being ambushed. There could be shootouts. So that also was very stressful. And I think, more than anything, when as a photojournalist, I've certainly, risked, sorry, it's my cat. I've certainly risked my life, frequently or numerous times, but I'm very careful about not risking other people's lives or, really understanding the gravity of that. And so, going into the park in DRC, there were always three of us, but the park was the size of Delaware. So we would be in different places on different patrols in different places in the park to be trying to cover as much as possible. But I was always, tremendously relieved at the end of each trip, just because the whole crew had gotten out without, harm or injury.
Wow. For someone like me, and probably a lot of people that are watching this and are going to be watching this later, who have they can't even relate to anything that you're talking about because it sounds horrific.
Sorry.
No, it sounds, what I mean by that, it sounds horrific to me because I'm picturing, and I've seen the film, obviously. I was getting nervous just watching some of those scenes. I can't imagine actually being there in those environments. But like with your background, and we'll get to that in a few minutes too, you've been through so many situations where you have put yourself in harm's way, like you mentioned, and you always try to be as careful as you can, particularly about yourself and not putting anyone else in those positions. I'm just kind of curious off the top of my head, do you feel a little desensitized to the danger level because you've been around it so much?
No, not at all. I actually think quite the contrary. I feel very lucky that, no one that I've ever been working with has, been killed or injured working with me, which typically would be speaking maybe a writer or, a driver or a translator. But I have had a lot of friends, people in photojournalism who, died in the course of their work, particularly in 2011 and 12. And so I think, if anything, I'm much more sensitized to it. With the crew that I had with me, hi, sweetie, one of the cameramen was engaged, and another one had 3 children, and I basically had made sure everybody had life insurance. And it's difficult conversations to have, but we have to fill out your beneficiary forms, because God forbid anything that happens to you, I want to make sure that your kids can all go to college, or so be it. And of course, I don't think anyone ever feels like, I think certainly any of the friends that I've had who were killed in their line of work would, wish that they hadn't been there in those final moments. But I suppose it's also looking at the totality of what you've done throughout your career, and if collectively, because of what you've done, then at some point maybe your luck will run out. But I don't take it for granted at all, and feel very protective of the people who work with me.
Okay, well, that's actually really I think it's actually good to hear that you're more sensitized to the situation. Again, as I was looking through your background and all the things that you've done, they talk about primary trauma, secondary trauma, PTSD, and those kind of things. And maybe there are some, elements of that that have creeped into your life. I don't know. After doing years of that type of work, it's almost like it's interesting that you've found ways to actually value things that much more because of what you've covered and what you've seen.
For sure. I mean, for whatever reason, I just happen to be a pretty resilient person. But that was one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about this issue, because with that experience that I had the first time, I saw elephants in the wild, and processing what I had just experienced in Afghanistan, and I had worked there for already at that point for in and out for 9 years. So, and had been exposed to a lot of conflict. But there were a number of really disturbing things that happened on that trip. And I always think lots of people in their lifetimes experience traumatic stress, and then it's in terms of how you process it. And if you're able to process it, what the difference between it being, a limited period of time in traumatic stress or becoming post-traumatic stress disorder. And I always felt that that experience that I had with the elephants was the difference between me having been able to process the traumatic stress from the embed and not. And so, there was this feeling of trying to give back to the elephants that they had given me, which was, healing and peace.
Okay, that's fantastic. And again, for people that haven't seen the film, what it's really showing on not only in the film but also on a global level of what that syndicate is like in terms of the poaching, where the ivory and the rhinoceros horns are moving to, maybe who's buying it. And I think it's also showing how we're eliminating species from the planet.
Yeah.
And so can you kind of speak to that whole process of things that they're not just maybe what you've seen or maybe learned when you see someone had poached an elephant? There's so many other tentacles beyond that.
But when it comes to, in a way that the poachers are typically kind of low-level foot soldiers that feed into a complex network. But in many ways, while I don't see them completely as victims, I also see them as people who are somewhat exploited because, in the scheme of things, they make relatively little money and also risk being, killed themselves when they're out poaching. But once you start getting into which you see in the film, these industrial scale size shipments, you're dealing with, criminal cartels that are completely inserted into the shipping industry that are able to get multiple tons of ivory from a port in Africa to destinations in Asia, and it's on a whole other scale. And those same people tend to be involved in lots of other forms of illicit trade. So it could be drugs, it could be guns. It's sort of like the parallel black market world that happens in the shipping industry. So yeah, the film looks at the criminality behind it, both in terms of the rangers who put their lives on the line, protecting national parks and elephants and other species, to the poachers as well, who can end up being killed. And I mean, I think in some of those scenes in the film, regardless of the situation, it's difficult not to feel compassion for people, even the poachers, and then it goes up to these large-scale shipments, in which, since you're in Seattle, you had a University of Washington, Dr. Sam Wasser is a big feature of the film, and he does lots of forensic work and DNA work on large-scale ivory seizures around the world.
Yeah, I was like, hey, when he first came on screen, I was like, I know that university. That's 15 minutes from where I live.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah, he is. And I liked when he was meeting with his team and what they're going to be doing next and when they're getting ready to travel. And like he was talking about just the sheer volume. I guess for myself, when I think about poachers, I think maybe a bag of things or something. But when they showed on those shipments, I mean, it was it was as far as the eye could see, basically, with some of the horns and the tusks and things that they had out. Yeah. And then his team's in there going one by one, trying to figure out where it came from, and so they can trace it back to what part of Africa, what country, and all other interesting things that it's like, wow. So they can really say, no, it's not all of these countries. It seems to be coming from these two or these three areas time and time again. And that was fascinating to learn about. I had no idea they had that kind of technology or scientific background to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wow. And one thing I've learned from, at least from some of the film directors I've talked to, is they always say that what they started with and what they ended with are two different things. Was that the case for you, or was it pretty much it kind of ended up the way you wanted it?
It was, that's an interesting thing. When I look back at what the proposal that I wrote for the seed funding for the film, a lot carried through. And the going into it, the northern white rhinos are referenced, but I think in terms of what ended up happening in their trajectory, where when I started filming there was 7, though actually in the documentary we really start with 5, but when I had first started doing the development there were 7, and watching this foreboding story of the northern whites in the midst of this global international wildlife trafficking crisis, really focus on elephants. But one is kind of the story of what happens when too little is done too late, and really I think personalizing extinction, because you're connecting with specific animals, of which there's only a few left on the planet, and actually currently 2, and then looking at conceptualizing the deaths of huge numbers of elephants.
Yeah, and again, I think it's such an important film, and for people hopefully get a chance to see it, because it has been out through 1091 for at least I think a week now, I want to say, so people can rent it or buy it and check it out. It's so worthwhile and worth your time for those people that are watching this right now. If you're not familiar with it, again, The Last Animals is the name of the documentary, and we're talking with Kate Brooks. And Kate, I know as you've mentioned many times, as I saw, your work as a photojournalist. What drew you to that particular area of photography or that line of work?
Gosh, well, I basically picked up a camera when I was in high school, enjoyed photography, and then I started college in DC and enrolled in a photojournalism class. I was a Russian major, actually. And the photojournalism class was taught by an editor at National Geographic, and he brought in different photographers. And it was just in that class where for the first time I thought, oh, I could do this as a career. Like, this is what I could do. And I just was like, okay, this is what I want to do. It clicked. And so I knew I wanted to do international work. I loved traveling, and because I had been a Russian major and spoke Russian fluently, I started my career in Russia, and I lived there basically until 9/11. And I have to say, there were a few years where I definitely did not necessarily think that I had what it took to be a war photographer. And I knew I wanted to do photojournalism, but I wasn't necessarily like dead set on being a war photographer. But the events of 9/11 and the years after really, I knew it was the story of my generation. And not only was I, fascinated by what was happening, I recognized how important it was to document in terms of history, and was relevant to me as an American. And so that's really how I ended up in Afghanistan onto Iraq. And then it just, sometimes I say it was like the year of living dangerously that went on for a decade and a half. Because I basically I moved to Pakistan a few weeks after 9/11 and stayed in the region for 15 years. So I lived for a while in Pakistan while I was primarily working in Afghanistan. Then I lived in Beirut for a total of 8 years, and I lived in Istanbul for a few years, traveling all over. So yeah, it really, it definitely ended up sort of defining my youth, and a huge part of my career as a photographer.
Yeah, and you've lived in so many different interesting places and worked in those places as well, like you just mentioned, for many years in some cases. Mm-hmm. What's it been like over that period of time, being not only an American but being a female American, doing the line of work that you do? I mean, there must be things where you've come into conflicts, or you're getting touched, groped, threatened, all kinds of other things, I would think, depending on where you were at the time.
It's an interesting thing. I actually have found that, typically speaking, being a woman is advantageous in this field, particularly. I mean, if you're working in the Muslim world, you typically have access to the world of women. And certainly in Afghanistan, I always felt like I was treated like, an honorary man, and when it came to work and traveling around the country. So, but then I could go into, the back room with the women. And I think that, typically speaking as well, people are less suspicious of women when they're working in really high intensity situations. In 2012, I was in Syria, and I was there on an official government visa, and it was during the war. Very few people nobody had been in for months on the Assad side of the conflict, and on a government visa. And I had worked in Syria before the war, so the Ministry of Information and various people, we had, I was in their system as having been there numerous times. But there was a point on that trip where the female journalist I was working with and I and our fixer, so it's 3 women, get in a car and drive on a highway to Homs, which, and we just drove. And the whole thing was really surreal because, the road was good until we got there, and then we get there and it's a completely sort of destroyed city. But I think, there's lots of things that I've been able to do because I am a woman that would have probably been harder as a man. And I think beyond that, I've been very lucky throughout my career in terms of close escapes and achieving the things that I kind of set out to do without their ever getting hurt.
Okay. As you're telling me these, these stories in the last 25 minutes, I'm curious, what do your loved ones think about this, or your family and friends? I mean, they obviously understand and support your career, but are there other times where they're like, would you please stop doing this and come back to DC and just settle down or something?
Oh yeah, we went through those things. I mean, it was really with my dad. It was like there was a progression. Like first, I lived in Russia, and he wasn't happy about that. And then I moved to Pakistan, and then he wished I was in Russia. And then I went to Afghanistan, and he wished I was in Pakistan. And then I went to Iraq. And there was that. And my mother, I wasn't always clear with my parents about the situations that I was in, to the extent that, I remember one time my dad seeing an article in Time magazine in which it was a different embed, but I was on an embed, and the vehicle in front of my vehicle got blown up, and my dad was like, so, are you planning on spending a lot more time with the military? And I was just like, oh God, like I really hadn't wanted him to see that article, but of course he did. But frankly, the only time where my parents ever asked me not to do something in the spring of 2013. So it was when I was finishing my fellowship at the University of Michigan. So nearly a year after that trip to Syria that I just mentioned. And my mother, in one phone call, asked me 5 times not to go back to Syria. And I listened. I haven't been back. I feel like after all the worry and risks I've put them through, and unfortunately, I had friends who were kidnapped in Syria, and some of them made it and some of them didn't. But I understood her fear and reassured her that I wouldn't be going back. So.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking, like, if I was doing what you're doing and describing, my mom would be doing probably like what your dad was doing. I would like what your mom did in this case. 5 times, please don't go back to Syria. Why can't you stay here in Seattle or come back home? Can't you take pictures of trees or something that doesn't shoot back at you or something? Oh my gosh. And so I'm kind of curious now, knowing that, and you've had such a prolific career, and we're kind of slowly coming out of this pandemic quarantine time. Do you plan on just following your passion then and continuing with photojournalism and filmmaking, or just kind of organically going wherever it kind of takes you in the future?
Well, I am, up until the pandemic, it was like photographing again for, the better part of a year. And I have a couple of film projects in development. It takes many more resources to make films and takes time. So I like the idea of, trying to do both. I think in terms of storytelling, I definitely find film to be the most dynamic medium. I think that, when you're able to catch people's attention for 15 minutes or 45 or an hour and a half, and really, in which they can go on a journey that they experience and feel, and they're also learning. Like there's nothing kind of more powerful than that. So I love it as a medium. I want to make more films. And, you know, for me, photography is like, you know, my hair. Like I have it. Well, hopefully I will. Sorry, I don't know why. But somebody once said that to me. I said to a friend of mine, I was like, when I was really deep in the film and hadn't been doing photography, she's like, oh, you'll be taking pictures when you're 90. You're a photographer. You're always going to be a photographer. So I kind of, you know, remember her saying that. Just at this point, you know, it's been so much a part of who I am. Yeah. But in storytelling medium, I do find, particularly now with just information overload and how, you know, the 24-hour news cycle that images don't necessarily, because the intake of information is so much, they don't necessarily have the impact that they did 30 years ago. I mean, of course, there are incredible iconic pictures that come out and you know, and I still believe in the importance of photographic documentation. But I think if you really have a, you know, a complex story to tell and really want to make a massive impact, film's the way to go.
Okay, and you may not be able to cite one of these, but is there a particular photo that you've taken that you always think that's the one that, for whatever reason, I will always love that particular photo?
There are a number, but I think, you know, one of my more iconic pictures is a picture that I took on my first trip into Afghanistan, which is a vaulted room that was a makeshift prison for a number of jihadis that had crossed over the border from Pakistan looking for American troops to kill, but at the time there weren't any American troops, and they got apprehended on the way back, and they were put in this makeshift prison with sort of this dome-shaped ceiling, and you know, there's you know, it feels like a painting, you know, the way that the light's streaming into the room, and I think that that's one of my favorite pictures. But yeah, a lot of my pictures I don't necessarily want to hang on my walls, yeah, but that's one, which is you know, painter related, that I love.
I'm pretty sure I know which one you're talking about, because if you're looking at the picture, the light streaming in from one side, and there's like, yeah, it's a beautiful image, and I understand what you're just saying about some of your other images. Although you're extremely proud of them, it may not be something you want to blow up and stick on your wall to see every day in your home. But I'm also curious, have you ever, or maybe have you dabbled in other fields of photography? Like, have you done any kind of, I don't know, high fashion or concerts or something that's outside of the photojournalism world?
I haven't. I've done, you know, portrait work, which, you know, I've spent a lot of time during those 15 years in the greater Middle East doing portraits for various newspapers and magazines of presidents and political leaders. So I photographed, you know, the former president of Afghanistan many times, the two former presidents of Pakistan, the King of Jordan, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, and various royalty in Saudi Arabia. And I enjoy portraiture, and I do think that that I have a talent within my talent for it, but it's not something that I have actively pursued, but would like to do that.
Okay, all right. I'm also just curious, have you taken any pictures of your cats?
Oh, tons. Oh my goodness. And I wish I have one here. I wish he came over, ran across the room, came over, but he didn't jump up. I adopted him about 3 months ago. And he is from Lebanon, and he was a Beirut blast survivor. and he's one eye, and he is the fluffiest, silliest, cutest cat. Which and yeah, we finally got him over here in January.
Oh, nice. Was that a long process to get him over here to the States?
It was, you know, what was tricky was the lockdowns that kept happening in Lebanon. So there was somebody from here who was going there and was supposed to be bringing back a number of animals, and her trip kept getting postponed. And in the end, she actually didn't go until quite recently, but we sought out somebody else coming over who brought over a number of animals. So yeah, there's a wonderful charity in Lebanon called Animals Lebanon, and they ended up with a lot of animals after the blast in August. And then also currently there's a real financial crisis in the country. So a lot of people have left the country, and there's an increase in pet abandonment. So they're regularly sending animals over to the US to forever homes. And I'm really lucky. I got this little guide. I have tons of pictures for him. So watch out. If you want one, you're going to get a whole bunch. But he's awesome. His name's Simba, and he looks like a Simba.
Oh, no, oh, nice. I'm not picturing a Simba in my head of your cat, but that's awesome that the organization's doing that and finding forever homes for these cats that have been in a place that they need to be moved somewhere else to find a nice home for them. So. Kate, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about The Last Animals and about your career. I'm such a fan of your work, both film and photo, and I hope that I get a chance to connect with you again down the road when you have something new to promote. Maybe it's a cat book, I don't know. Or
Portraits, next film. It would be my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, and I really hope that your viewers have a chance to see the film. There's sad moments, but I think it's also really inspiring and definitely worth everybody seeing.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And again, for folks out there, it's on 1091 Pictures. I'll put the link in the YouTube description so you can click right on that to go watch the film tonight, right after this interview. And again, Kate, thank you so much for taking the time. Stay safe over there in DC, and hopefully I can talk to you sooner than later.
Sounds good. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.